Tjutken ellet soeskun je ene de kalmoch de tjem, na alien tmich, dem skres, hier o demtgem he is a mettendem guch. I would also like to acknowledge the Coast Salish people who live in this unceded territory. And unlike a couple of the other speakers, it's almost a wordless presentation that I have, but I was just doing a little bit of math. I've taught for SFU actually for 30 years. It doesn't seem that long. So I was pretty young when I started out. And I think I've taught 7 courses on campus, and hundreds probably as they add up in those other places in Indigenous communities. And so I'll tell you a bit about the practice of doing that and how my own teaching as caring about and for students through this ethics of care, but also about the subject matter that I've been called on to teach, much of which involves Indigenous languages and the Indigenous ethnobotany and sense of being on the land. Before I move on to some of that, I would like to pay homage to my teachers. None of these here have PhDs in the Western sense, but they've been my teachers for the last, actually going on more than 30 years, when I was a graduate student. And they're all speakers or were speakers of their Indigenous languages. My home language is what in Europe they call a minority language, Frisian Plattdeutsch. And I came to Haida Gwaii as a young graduate student and was raised by the gentleman on the top left, Lana Stung, Adam Bell, and by Sandalne, Emma Matthews, who told me, we'll raise your hideaway now. And I took that serious. They adopted me into the Yahkulanas Raven clan in Masset, and it's become a lifelong obligation and a lifelong path of learning on my own part. This is a really amazing and difficult language, but also to give back by way of training the next generation of speakers. In the mid-1980s, I thought I was taking a very brief detour through the interior of BC. It's actually kind of a funny story. My mother from Northwest Germany was with me with our young daughter. And we were driving by what is now my home, the Skicheston Reserve in the interior. And I had never been to the interior, always having lived in Haida Gwaii, having been raised on the coast before. And so my mother and I turned to each other and said something that amounted to, what a godforsaken area is this here? And my husband, Chief Ron Ignace, said, well, you cursed yourself right there because you got hung up here. And so the Secwepemc community has become my third home, and it's my home language there and has been for the last 30 years. And it's been an equally amazing, sometimes challenging path to master that difficult language and to bring it back to the next generation. So I want to talk a little bit more about the context in which myself, my colleague Peter Jacobs, my other colleague Donna Gertz here on campus, and many other peers and friends that we have in the Indigenous community and in universities teach Indigenous languages. First of all, the teaching of Indigenous languages functions in an entirely different context than the teaching of heritage languages does here in North America and in other places in the world. Most of our languages are hanging by a thread, having a few speakers, if we're lucky, a couple of hundred, in most of our cases here in BC and even in the Yukon, a handful and sometimes shrinking. And sometimes in the last few years it has gone down to almost none. And those are, of course, the people that were blessed to be raised with their languages in the home. So the most daunting task is to support the creation of a new generation of speakers that are by and large second language learners or additional language learners of their languages, And it's a daunting task because we can't send our kids to some homeland where the language is still spoken by everybody. If you want to get immersed in French, send your child to France. If you want to get immersed in Punjabi, send your child to that part of the world. So it's becoming increasingly difficult to actually get the kind of doses of the language that our learners need to become really good at it. And of course, as you know, it also involves the recovery and overcoming the trauma, the cultural genocide, the dispossession from the language that went on for 3 to 4 generations. And what adds to that is Indigenous languages are incredibly complex, difficult to learn, and we do this kind of in the absence of these libraries and bookshelves of resources that people in other disciplines, university teachers have to teach that subject matter. We often have to create our content as we're teaching, and we have to create our own proficiency in the language to stay ahead of our students. And we do have bright students who are actually doing really well. And the experience of the last decades has shown that young or not so young adults can learn their Indigenous languages, can become the next warriors, torchbearers of those languages. And we have many examples that we have from among our different classes and different languages where they're actually getting pretty darn good at it. So when I started on this project of bringing SFU to the community more than 30 years ago, it came out of what was then proclaimed by our Assembly of First Nation and Indigenous educators in Canada as native control of native education. Post-secondary institutions had by and large failed Indigenous people. And we actually, being in Kamloops at the time, we approached what was then the local college, Caribou College, and the attitude was, bring them here, we'll teach them. And of course, that was not what our students had in mind. Our average student was between, and continues to be in many cases, between 18 and 80 from Indigenous communities where there was no record of prior degrees, prior education. The teaching, as Catherine so nicely explained, it's taken me into the plateaus of the interior mountains and the beaches of Haida Gwaii. But the place that you see in the middle there is the former Kamloops Indian Residential School, which still stands. It was at one point the largest Indian residential school in the country. And generations of people in our nation and neighboring nations attended there for 3 to 4 generations between the 1920s and about 1980. But this is where our learners relearned their language when we first started out. Our first classroom was the former girls' dorm in the residential school. It still had the little sinks on the wall, and many of our students that came back to learn their language actually had attended there. And that to me really strongly speaks to their ethic of care, of caring about their language and wanting to reclaim it. We've had our classes in the basements of band offices. We taught Sahuat Mokchin for a semester or so in the back of our little church on the Skitchiston Reserve, which had at one point been a jail for people from the community, and of course in many First Nations schools. One lesson that I learned very quickly as our elders actually asked me, can you come and help and work with us to teach and bring back our language, was that it has to be an inherently collaborative effort. It has over all these years as a norm, blurred the difference between who's the teacher and who's the student. And we often team teach together. They're my university professors that I look up to, but they're becoming fewer and fewer as well. And so it's important that we consider one another as colleagues, they are my teachers as much as I'm theirs. And it also, besides collaboration, takes the respect for the language. I think, Panos, you said it's this amazing thing about knowledge, and that's, I think, what brings us together too in bringing back and in teaching languages. A few years ago when we were sitting on the beach in Haida Gwaii, one of my friends said, well, you know, why do you beat yourself up doing this? Why do you care? And I said in the end, it's because I love this language. And I think the linguist Edward Sapir spoke of the genius of languages, as each particular language, like all of our indigenous languages, have these amazing ways of looking at the world in ways that no one else does. In Secwepemctsín, each time we speak of ourselves, speaking in the I form, we have to use a diminutive, which raises the person we're speaking to and makes us humble. And likewise, we have in many of our languages evidentials that speak to the type of experience that we have. Did we personally experience something? Did we know it by hearsay? Do we know it from circumstantial or sensual evidence? And you can do all those things in the English language, but we have them built into the very categories of the language. So each time we speak, we have to make those choices of acknowledging the source of evidence. And I find in the end that it's those things that make up the genius of languages. That's what attracts and draws students to make that commitment to spend thousands of hours to get actually really good. When I think it was in 1992, I was first called upon by a number of elders in our nation and language learners to teach a course on Secwepemc literacy, orthography. And at that point, I thought, well, I better do my homework and go through my text to be thorough, do a little bit of unraveling of what the history of literacy and orthography is. So I kind of started talking a little bit, oh, do you know about how the Roman alphabet came about, and talking about Sumerian writing and so forth. And they all looked at me and as though I was kind of crazy, because when I asked them, well, what do you know about the history of the alphabet that we use? They all said, well, it came from Art Kuipers, the linguist. So it wasn't like they needed to know that deep European and Middle Eastern history of writing. What mattered was, there was a guy who'd come here and he'd showed them how to use letters on a typewriter. And what that really taught me too is, as I've continued to work on research on Secwepemc history, language, and culture, how important it is to view the teaching that we do, the ontology and epistemology, for lack of better terms, that connect us to the language and the worldview that we speak of and talk about. So we've been working together, going back some decades with elders, of how can we actually express that worldview and the teachings that it entails through the very categories of our language. And what comes to mind there is this lady here, the late Nellie Taylor. Back in about 1994, she said to me one day, long time ago, Secwepemc people looked after the land and all the animals and plants, everything in it. That's why they always had plenty to fish. They had deer to hunt and plants to gather for food and medicine. But they had to practice for it and learn about everything on the land first for a long time. Then they knew how to look after it. It was also important for the elders to share each other's knowledge. That was how they learned and built up their understanding. What knowledge they shared had to be exact. And you may think, oh, these are just some pretty plain and simple and innocuous words as they're translated from Secwepemctsín here. But I think there's some really fundamental principles behind that as teachers and in what we do, that we ought to take into account. First of all, she talks about the gathering of knowledge through experience and observation, in turn based on prior experience. She talks about the sharing of knowledge through communication and mutual validation that involves people, places, events, and the deeds of ancestors. And she speaks to the reciprocal and relational accountability among all sentient beings on the land that includes humans, but not humans on top of that. And you do all that through the principle of etzchem, which means practicing in both a practical sense of doing, repeating, learning, accumulating knowledge, and then doing it some more, but also in the spiritual sense of how you connect with ancestors, with beings on the land. And I think we can learn something about that. And I found that for the students and in the context in which I work, that connection to Secwepemc knowledge in this case needs to be the first and foremost one. We can't do it the other way around, that we approach things from a Western perspective first and then try to add a little dose of Indigenous knowledge to it, but it needs to come from within. Finally, it's also the reclaiming of knowledge, because that's what it is. It's not for idle purposes. Every one of my students learns Secwepemc, Haida, or whatever language they're learning out of a deep conviction that they need to do their part to protect the language, to bring it back, and for future generations. And my student, Tonya Willard, who actually is an assistant professor in fine arts at Okanagan University, UBC Okanagan, she shared with me that my learning in our language has allowed me to see and visualize concepts in our language that have been immeasurably influential. So she sees her language learning as connected to her art and as it integrates into the knowledge that she gathers. And just a little bit on language on the land, but also through Indigenous ecology and ethnobotany, if you want. One of the important aspects of teaching in the context in which I teach is, I think some years ago, we formed the concept of classrooms without walls. My students tell me, as they've told me here when I've ventured out and taught ethnobotany a couple of times, that the learning on the land is transformative. And that's what we need to enable, and that's what we need to do more of. And bringing together, in this case, also Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. And getting back to the excitement also of gathering new knowledge. One of the ways in which I'm finding students become excited about, first of all, the knowledge of their own ancestors, but then also the knowledge that's out there that's shared among Western scientists is through ways of linking them, of connecting them. And I was really intrigued this spring when I taught ethnobotany in the Kamloops area. I was approached by Dr. Laurie Daniels, who's a forest ecologist at UBC. Can we take your class and can I bring a few students? So we said fine, and so they learned alongside my own students. But then she also shared the work that she was doing, where she measures fire scars in trees as there have been burns over time, and some of those trees are a few hundred years old. And then she, through taking core samples, she and her students could determine not only how old the trees were, at which time of the year had the fires happened. And they then mapped it out quantitatively. And it turned out that as our elders basically had kind of told us and predicted, burns occurred according to those quantitative data in cycles of 7 to 20 years. 75% of the fires in the area they did this were human-made, unlike the forest fires we have now that get away on us. And so it was and then in 1863, it stopped. So, and that was when the smallpox epidemic happened that killed 75% of our people. So I think that to me brings back some of that excitement and of finding new knowledge that combines both the Indigenous worldview, that's the pillar of what we do, but in addition to that, it puts into perspective what we can do with other kinds of science. Okay, thank you.